In this video, I wanted to do an introduction about risk mitigation. Everywhere we go, there's risks for most everything we do, and there are people whose full-time jobs are to do nothing but look at risks and calculate out what the likelihood of them happening are and what the cost of that happening would be. For instance, skydiving probably has a fairly high risk with it, but enough people have gone through it and made it somewhat safe that the risk is actually pretty small at this point. Small if you know what you're doing. Now, I don't, so I don't do that. But yeah, so risk mitigation. There's risks everywhere. What we want to do is we want to find out what those risks are and then do what we can to mitigate them, to make them as small as possible. So we can start off with this by talking about ways to calculate risk. So we'll start off on the left-hand side here. There's a lot of different terminology that we can talk about that goes into calculating out risks. First one's here, mean time to failure or mean time between failure. This is a way of calculating out what the likelihood of something failing would be. For instance, when you buy a hard disk drive, oftentimes a vendor will give you a mean time to failure. And basically says that this device, this hard drive, should last for, 5 years. Not sure what they are right now, but when the first SSDs started coming out for consumer level or consumer grade, it was rated to about 5 years of continual use for those SSDs. Because it's 5 years, the average lifespan of a computer is about 3. That means that hard drive would survive throughout the majority of that computer's lifespan. Similar to mean time to failure, or mean time between failure. Actually, before I go on, even though an MTBF may be given of 5 years, that's mean time. That's the mathematical average, not necessarily a guarantee. Some will last significantly longer than 5 years. Some will last significantly less than 5 years. All right, so similar to mean time between failure or mean time to failure is the exposure factor. Essentially the likelihood of an event happening, the likelihood of a failure. So you could look at it as the likelihood of a hard drive failing, or if you looked at, say, a car accident. Say you're a car insurance company, and therefore what's the likelihood of somebody getting into an accident? It's because of things like the exposure factor that they're able to say young men pay more money than older ladies because young men are traditionally more aggressive drivers and therefore have a higher exposure factor, a higher likelihood of having an accident. Therefore, we can charge more money. Along with the exposure factor is the asset value. So if the exposure factor is the likelihood of an accident, the asset value would be, well, the cost of that accident. So if I have a very, very high likelihood of an accident, of driving a car and having an accident, but the cost of that accident is really low, then it doesn't really matter how high the likelihood is, the cost is still going to be fairly low. So total, the entire accident itself would be a fairly minimal item. However, if I have a very expensive asset, such as an Aston Martin car, one of those $1.3 million cars out there, I would probably only want somebody with a very good driving record or a very low exposure factor to drive it. All right, then we get into some of these other items. A single loss expectancy. What is the likelihood of a single car accident costing me? Is an average car accident going to cost me $500 or $50,000? What is the average or the expected cost of that one incident? Then have an annual rate of occurrence. How frequently or how many times in a year is somebody going to be in a car accident? And then the annual loss expectancy. Hopefully I haven't lost you too far with all of these terms. It can start hitting the ground right here as we do some math. So let's see, the single loss expectancy, this guy right here. Actually, let me clear this out. The single loss expectancy or the amount of money that a single car accident is going to cost me, is equal to the asset value times the exposure factor. A high exposure factor and a high asset value causes a high single loss expectancy. A low exposure factor and a low asset value causes a low single loss expectancy, and then high exposure factor but low asset value causes a medium single loss expectancy. All right, so then we can take that single loss expectancy and we multiply it by the annual rate of occurrence. So if I know that a single loss is going to cost me, say, $10,000, and that is likely going to happen 3 times a year, so 10,000 times 3, then my annual rate of occurrence will be $30,000. Now, the great thing about calculating out this risk, one, it's a pain because you have to start figuring out what's the mean time between failure, what's the asset value, what's the exposure factor, and then start calculating out how much each of these is going to cost you. But the great thing is once you've done all that, you can then start being a little bit more intelligent about the choices you make. For instance, if my asset value is $1, and my exposure factor is, 5%. Then my single loss expectancy is asset value times the exposure factor, which is about 20 cents? No, 5 cents. So 5 cents is my single loss expectancy. Let's say that this is the self-check line. And at the supermarket, somebody's gone to the supermarket, they've gone to the self-check line, they've grabbed the organic bananas, but they scan them through as the regular bananas. Well, the likelihood of somebody actually doing that is pretty low. Most people, I think, are honest when they hit those self-check lines, so the likelihood of them actually lying when they're scanning it through is going to be pretty low. Even if they do lie, the total cost is going to be pretty low as well. Therefore, the single loss expectancy, or SLE, is only 5 cents in this case. Okay, well, how frequently is that going to happen over a year? Let's say the annual rate of occurrence is, 3 times per day. So that makes 900. 900 times a year, so that the SLE of 050 times 900, 005 times 900 is $45 if my math pans out there. So if my math pans out, what we're saying is people going up to these self-check lines and running through their organic bananas as non-organic bananas is going to cost the supermarket a total of $45 a year. That's a pretty low cost, and therefore they may consider that the self-check lines are quick and efficient and friendly for the end users. Therefore, it may be worthwhile to simply allow that exposure, allow that risk to continue without changing it, because $45 is pretty low for an entire year for the business. Now, that may actually start to increase, at which point they can then look at this ALE right here and say, you know what, it's no longer $45, it's now $400, we need to change something. And then they can start implementing changes as long as the change does not cost more than the ALE. If the ALE is significantly less than the change that's required, it may not be worthwhile to implement it. By the way, you may end up taking the certification here and you may see a question similar along these lines of an incident happens that costs $10,000 and it happens 3 times a year, and to fix it costs $50,000. Well, if it happens 3 times a year and it costs $10,000, that's a $30,000 ALE, and the fix costs $50,000. That means it might be better just to have your computers hacked 3 times a year than it would be to implement the fix to stop it from happening. All right, So that's a whole lot of math. Calculating the risks, really what it comes down to is you have to find out what the risks are. And then you have to evaluate whether they should be fixed or not, how important they are, and how to fix them. One example is to come up with a spreadsheet similar to this. This looks to be something to do with painting or cleaning or construction of some sort. And what they have is they have an activity such as working on a scaffold and what other hazards or risks there may be associated with them. What they then do is they have this risk matrix over here, and on one side they have the likelihood or the exposure factor identified. How likely is it for an event to happen? Very unlikely all the way up to very likely. On this side right here, they have the cost or the asset value identified. In this case, because it has to do with manpower, they're referring to physical harm as opposed to dollars or loss of product. But they're able to identify the total event might not hurt anybody at all, might hurt them a little bit, or might hurt them a whole lot. By then putting numbers on these, in this case from 1 to 5, they're able to extract out the total severity or risk evaluation of the whole thing, which they then identify right there. Hey, look at that. When they're all done with that, they can then look at that total risk level, and be able to say, hey, you know what, this guy right here, that's a 20. Let's come up with a control measure to put in place, and then see if we can change our risk level to something more palatable. 20, falling from a high level of scaffolding is very likely and very dangerous. So let's put some control measures of, a railing or some PPE or training or whatever might be necessary in this case in order to limit the exposure, and then change the risk level to something hopefully very much unlikely and very minimal as far as danger. So this right here is a great example of one risk evaluation method. All right, controls. Control. We must learn control. The cybersecurity realm loves to have controls. They love to have terms that you need to know, and this is some of them. There are 6 controls that are identified that are utilized in a lot of security certifications. So if you plan on taking any of these certifications, you will want to know what these are and what some common examples of them are. The first one would be a deterrent control, which is there to discourage an attack. An example of a deterrent control would be a sign that says, "Beware of dog." Now, in some places of the world, people love dogs, and when you see that sign, that's actually saying, "Hey, come pet me." But hopefully, in a situation where you want to protect something, it is actually a deterrent, which means stay away. This is a dangerous animal. Next type of control would be a preventative control, something that will prevent an attack. An example of a preventative control for, say, a building or a business might be really bright lights around the outside of the building. This would make it so that if somebody tried to break into the building in the middle of the night, the lights would be extremely bright and would help prevent them from sneaking up to the building being unseen. By the way, that is one of the reasons why you will oftentimes see the big, huge like data centers or buildings like that with very nicely manicured lawns. They don't want big shrubs. They don't want trees anywhere nearby that can help prevent line of sight. It's just simply a preventative control that helps prevent the attack. Next one is a physical control, which helps prevent the attack again. Physical controls, well, fences. If I have to climb over a fence, then it helps minimize the likelihood of me breaking in. Locks on the doors. If I have to break a lock, it helps prevent me from breaking in. See, next one, detective controls. It helps identify what happened in an attack. A couple of these would be such as motion detectors. When a motion detector detects motion in an area, say around the building before somebody gets in, then it can help encourage somebody to go check out that motion, or a security camera as well to help both record, which is kind of a corrective or compensating control, but then also alert security to something going on in an area that they shouldn't be. Let's see, compensating controls, which helps provide an alternative to normal. So if something is going wrong, if somebody's breaking in, what is our backup plan? What's our plan B or our secondary strategy? That might be something such as a siren going off or calling up the police in order to have an alternative to normal business. Probably a better example of an alternative control would be a UPS or a power generator. If the power goes out in a building, a UPS helps keep the lights on for a couple of minutes, and then the generator kicks in and provides mains power for the building to continue to operate during a power outage. And then lastly, the corrective control, which helps minimize the damage after an attack. This would be like if somebody broke into a building, maybe they drove a truck through the front door. Once they're gone, once the event is over, it would be repairing the door, stopping or minimize the after damage effects. For instance, if somebody breaks down your door and then you don't replace it, well, the likelihood of somebody coming in after the fact and stealing even more is pretty high. So you have to minimize the damage after the fact. All right. So those are our controls. Like I said, definitely make sure you know what those are. Make sure you know some examples of them. And I only gave you a few. If you look online, you will find dozens of examples for each of those control types. All right, and then talking about managing risks, some of the ways that you can help to manage risks or minimize risks in your environment. A couple of my favorites are standardization. We'll start off there. If everything is exactly the same, if all the computers in your company are exactly the same, all your servers are the same, all your network gear is the same, then it helps to identify what might be going on. If everything in your environment starts breaking at the same time, then you can chalk it up to the fact that maybe there is a flaw in the manufacturing of these systems. If all my desktops start dying at around the same time, then I can assume the manufacturer had a flaw because I bought them all at the same time. But if only one machine starts having an issue, then I can start being able to compare and contrast against other machines that are working fine. Along with standardization is automation. If all of my systems look exactly the same, then everything I do on one machine, I should be able to do on all of them, such as configuring a firewall or installing software or changing user permissions. I should be able to automate all of that. And as long as everything is the same, once I've automated on one machine, I should be able to automate that against all of the machines. Next one, testing. Always test. Testing in production is never a good solution. You should always have a test environment, especially in today's world with virtual machines. It's very, very easy to build up virtual machines with evaluation licenses for things, or even getting a small sandbox on a cloud service such as Amazon or Azure. Once you have this testing environment built up, you can go ahead and implement your changes, your automated changes against the testing environment to ensure everything works flawlessly. And then only once everything is working flawlessly do you try to automate it, or do you try to push it out. Speaking of pushing out changes, well, change management. Very rarely does anything ever happen in your business to where it has to be deployed right now, where a change has to be implemented immediately. In which case, those changes should be documented well ahead of time, with both the reason as well as what is being documented or what is being changed, and if possible, the scripts or configurations defined in that change. That change could then be stored in a centralized change management archive and communicated out to the rest of the organization so that they know, hey, on Friday at 6 p.m., we're going to be making a change to the firewall. That tells everybody across the entire company that something is going to be happening at that time, and if anything is broken after the fact, who to contact because something's broke. You just don't really want to surprise people anymore. With that being said, change management, you really want to communicate everything ahead of time and plan it ahead of time. Occasionally, that's not always possible, which is why you have incident management. Incident management oftentimes is synonymous with help desk. My mouse is broken. Can you get me a new mouse? I have a virus on my computer. Can you come clean it? My laptop was stolen last night. I need a new one. These are all incidents that have to be managed immediately and as quickly and as smoothly as possible. You'll want to make sure that you have an incident management process in place for the various levels of incidents in your place or in your organization. Replacing a mouse is very much important, but is not the most critical item in the organization as opposed to an active virus on a computer. You would definitely want to have some organization as far as prioritizing where to focus your efforts on. Policies. Policies kind of go into really everything else up here. Because you can have policies for a lot of different items, and you want to make sure that these are well defined in a lot of cases. For instance, if you may want to have an acceptable use policy that is defined for all the employees in your company so that they know when you're on the company time, this is the acceptable things for you to be doing on the business. These are the acceptable types of websites for you to be visiting. These are the acceptable uses of our corporate assets. Just because you have a company car doesn't mean you can take it down to the drag strip and try to race the quarter mile. That is not an acceptable use of the corporate car. So an acceptable use policy is very important to have in most organizations. Other policies you may have, security policies. A lot of times security policies don't affect the average frontline worker, but they should definitely be in place so that if something occurs, you can then reflect back to what the standard security policies and procedures are for incidents and changes in the organization. Other policies, email policies, all emails are subject to a search and should only be business related. Change and incident management policies, cybersecurity awareness policies, lots of different policies. Unfortunately, they're a pain to write. But the great thing is that a lot of these policies are already defined and publicly available online, just ready for you to tweak for your organization's needs. And then lastly, as far as managing risk is training. Now, this training could be very specific to a person's job. For instance, if they are driving a forklift, you want to make sure that they have forklift training. Forklift, not forklift, excuse me. You want to make sure they are trained and certified to operate a forklift before they ever sit in the seat of a forklift itself. Not doing that is just foolhardy and just asking for physical damage to your products and or personnel. Additionally, you should have training on several other items in the environment, such as fire safety, possibly CPR training, as well as cybersecurity awareness training, so that when events along those lines come up, people are prepared and ready for them, and they're not surprised. Okay, there you go. There's an introduction to risk mitigation. There is a whole lot more as far as risk mitigation, especially when you get into specific areas. Financial realm has a whole lot of risk mitigation. Construction has specific risk mitigations. Every single organization is going to have very specific needs for risk mitigation. This hopefully is a good introduction for you.